The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the large windows of the penthouse suite. The rhythmic crash of waves below might have comforted most, but for Henry Dawson, it was a cruel reminder of time slipping away. The once proud tycoon, whose name had commanded respect in Newport's elite circles, now lived a life of quiet regret. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, his thoughts heavy as they often were these days. 25 years ago, this suite, this mansion, and his fortune had been his entire identity. Back then, Henry had been a man driven by ambition and blinded by pride. Eleanor Dawson, his formidable mother, had been his guiding force, though now, in hindsight, he wondered if it had been guidance or manipulation. He could still picture the scene vividly. Abigail Morgan, standing at the base of the grand staircase, clutching her belongings, her voice trembling as she told him she was pregnant. Pregnant. The word had felt like a betrayal back then, as absurd as it seemed now. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind even now, cruel and calculating. That child isn't yours, Henry. She's only here to trap you and take your fortune. And he had believed her, believed every venomous word she had whispered. With that same arrogance that had defined his youth, he'd sent Abigail away. Her tear-streaked face haunted him to this day. He downed the rest of his drink and set the glass on the table with more force than intended. The regret felt heavier as the years piled on. Abigail had disappeared from his life, taking the child he'd been too blind to accept. He hadn't searched for her, hadn't called. His pride wouldn't allow it, and his mother certainly wouldn't have tolerated it. The years since had been unkind in their own way. Wealth and success were no longer enough to fill the void Abigail had left. His relationships were shallow, fleeting affairs, and even his business ventures lacked the thrill they once held. At 52, Henry was a man burdened by his past, a man searching for a way to ease the relentless ache of his regrets. It was this gnawing sense of emptiness that had driven him to book a last-minute ticket on a luxury Caribbean cruise. He had told himself it was for relaxation, an escape from the monotony of his Newport estate. But deep down, he knew it was something more. He was running from himself, from the ghosts of the choices he'd made. The cruise ship was opulent, as expected, with its sparkling chandeliers, polished wooden decks, and the soft murmur of jazz floating through the grand atrium. Henry, dressed sharply in a tailored gray suit, blended seamlessly with the crowd of wealthy passengers, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't quite belong. Not anymore. On the second evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry found himself seated in the lavish dining room. The tables were adorned with fine china and flickering candlelight, and the air buzzed with the sound of laughter and conversation. The setting was beautiful, but Henry's thoughts were elsewhere. As the waiter poured his wine, his gaze wandered to the other side of the room. That's when he saw her. For a moment, his heart stopped. A woman stood by one of the grand windows, her silhouette bathed in the warm glow of the chandelier. She wasn't just beautiful. She was familiar, painfully familiar. The shape of her face, the way she tilted her head, it all came rushing back like a tidal wave. Abigail. No, it couldn't be. He blinked, willing the image to disappear. But when he opened his eyes, she was still there, and next to her, a young man stood tall, his features sharp and unmistakable. Henry's breath caught in his throat. The resemblance was uncanny. The man, no, the boy, was the spitting image of Henry himself at that age. Henry gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. It couldn't be a coincidence. The boy, barely in his 20s, had Henry's jawline, his piercing blue eyes, and Abigail. It was her. He was certain of it. He had to know. He had to approach them. But as he began to rise from his seat, the fear set in. What would he say? What if he was wrong? What if, after all these years, Abigail hated him? The doubts swirled in his mind, but one thought rose above the rest. If I walk away now, I may never have another chance. As the dinner carried on around him, Henry's world narrowed to just one goal. He needed answers, and for the first time in decades, he was willing to face the past, head on. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he straightened his suit jacket, his mind racing with questions. Was it truly Abigail? And if it was, why was she here? And that young man, was he really his son for years? The thought of that child had been buried deep under layers of denial and regret. Now, it was as though fate had unearthed it and placed it squarely in front of him. The clinking of glasses and the hum of conversations filled the dining hall, but Henry hardly noticed. He wove through the maze of tables, his polished shoes tapping softly on the hardwood floor. Abigail and the young man were seated near the far window, their table lit by the soft glow of a golden chandelier. As he approached, Henry caught snippets of their conversation, though his mind was too fogged with anticipation to process their words. Finally, he reached their table. Abigail looked up, her expression shifting from calm to shock in an instant. Her grip on the stem of her wineglass tightened, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Abigail," Henry said, his voice lower than he intended. It carried a mix of disbelief and longing. As if uttering her name made the years between them dissolve, she stared at him, her face unreadable, but the tension in her body betrayed her unease. "Henry," she replied, her tone sharp and deliberate. "I didn't expect to see you here." Her words stung more than he anticipated. Abigail's eyes, once filled with warmth and affection, now held a steely resolve. She had changed, no longer the young woman he remembered. There was an air of authority about her, the confidence of someone who had weathered life's storms and emerged stronger. Henry faltered, searching for the right words. He glanced at the young man sitting beside her, who was now studying him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Henry forced a polite smile. "And you must be Jacob," the young man said, his tone neutral but firm. "Jacob Morgan." The name struck Henry like a hammer. Jacob, a name he'd never given the chance to form in his own mind. He nodded, trying to steady himself. "It's nice to meet you, Jacob." Jacob raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Do we know each other?" Before Henry could respond, Abigail interjected, "No, Jacob. Mr. Dawson and I knew each other a long time ago." Her voice carried an edge that made it clear she wanted the conversation to end. But Henry couldn't let it. Not yet. "Abigail," he began, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Please, can we talk? Just for a moment?" Abigail's eyes narrowed. She glanced at Jacob, who was now frowning at the tension between them. After a pause, she turned back to Henry. "Not here." Henry nodded, relief washing over him. "Of course, whenever you're ready." "I'm not ready, Henry," she said sharply, her words slicing through him. "And I may never be." With that, she turned her attention back to Jacob, dismissing Henry as though he were a distant memory. For a moment, Henry stood there, stunned. He had expected resistance, but the coldness in her voice was more than he was prepared for. He returned to his table, the weight of the encounter settling heavily on his shoulders. From across the room, he stole glances at Abigail and Jacob. They laughed at something Jacob said, their bond apparent. It was a stark contrast to the fractured connection he was desperate to mend. Later that evening, as the dining hall emptied and the soft sounds of a piano echoed through the lounge, Henry lingered near the bar. He sipped his drink slowly, his mind replaying every word Abigail had said. He was lost in thought when a voice broke through his reverie. "You don't give up easily, do you?" Henry turned to see Abigail standing a few feet away, arms crossed. She wasn't smiling, but there was a glimmer of curiosity in her eyes. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her tone guarded. "What are you doing on this cruise, Henry?" "Running away," he admitted, surprising even himself with his honesty. "From my life, my regrets, and maybe from myself." Abigail's expression softened, just for a moment. Then she straightened, her resolve returning. "Well, you've found what you were running from. Or should I say who?" Henry nodded. "Abigail, I know I hurt you. I've lived with that pain every day since. And now, seeing you here, seeing Jacob." His voice broke slightly, and he steadied himself. "Is he—" "Don't," Abigail interrupted, her voice firm. "Don't finish that sentence, Henry. You lost the right to ask that question when you threw me out of your life." Her words were a punch to the gut, but he knew she was right. He'd forfeited any claim to their shared past. "You're right," he said quietly, "but I'd like to try to make things right, if you'll let me." Abigail studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Henry standing alone. Grappling with the weight of his choices, Henry spent the rest of the evening pacing the deck of the cruise ship, the cool Caribbean breeze doing little to calm his storm of emotions. The sound of waves lapping against the ship's hull seemed distant, drowned out by the echo of Abigail's words. Her coldness was warranted. He couldn't deny that, but it cut deeper than he expected. He found himself replaying every detail of their brief exchange, searching for any sign that the warmth he once knew in her still existed. Abigail's icy demeanor told him she was far from forgiving, and who could blame her? The young man, Jacob, had been the most striking revelation. Henry hadn't needed Abigail's confirmation to see it. Jacob was his son. The resemblance was undeniable. The next morning, Henry rose early, though he'd hardly slept. Dressed in a casual linen shirt and slacks, he wandered the ship's sprawling deck until he stumbled upon the outdoor cafe. There, seated at a corner table, was Jacob, alone. For a moment, Henry hesitated. This was his chance to talk to the boy. No, the man. He'd never had the courage to find. But what could he say, before his thoughts could paralyze him? Jacob looked up, locking eyes with Henry. "Good morning," Henry said, forcing a small smile as he approached. Jacob nodded, his expression neutral but curious. "Morning. Mind if I join you?" Henry gestured toward the empty chair across from him. Jacob hesitated, then shrugged. "Sure, why not?" Henry sat, suddenly aware of how awkward this must seem. For Jacob, he was likely just a stranger, a man who had intruded on a quiet family dinner the night before. Still, Henry felt a pull he couldn't ignore. "Jacob," Henry began, his voice tentative. "I didn't get a chance to properly introduce myself last night. I'm Henry Dawson." Jacob raised an eyebrow, sipping his coffee before setting the mug down. "I know. My mom told me who you are." Henry's chest tightened. "And what did she tell you?" Jacob leaned back, crossing his arms. "She said you used to know her. That's about it." His tone was guarded, and Henry couldn't tell if it was indifference or a quiet challenge. "Well, that's true," Henry admitted, leaning forward slightly. "I knew your mother a long time ago. And if it's all right, I'd like to tell you more about that." Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why? What's your angle?" The question caught Henry off guard, but he understood the skepticism. "I don't have an angle," he said honestly. I made mistakes in my past. Mistakes that hurt people I cared about deeply. Seeing you and your mother again, it's made me realize I need to face those mistakes." Jacob studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Sounds like something you should talk to my mom about." "I've tried," Henry said, his voice laced with quiet frustration. "But she won't hear me out." Jacob smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Can you blame her?" "No," Henry said quickly. "I don't. But I'm hoping. Maybe you'll give me a chance to explain." Jacob's posture softened slightly, though his guard was still up. "Explain what, exactly?" Meanwhile, Abigail sat alone in her cabin, her hands gripping the edges of a weathered leather journal. Inside were letters she had never intended to share. Letters that Eleanor Dawson had sent years ago, filled with venomous lies and threats. Abigail had kept them as a reminder of the nightmare she endured, though she rarely opened the journal anymore. But seeing Henry again had stirred something in her, an urge to confront the ghosts of her past. She thought of Jacob and the way he had looked at Henry during their brief encounter. He didn't know the full story. She had been careful to shield him from the pain of abandonment. But now, with Henry re-entering their lives, the truth felt like a ticking time bomb. Abigail had spent decades building a life of strength and independence. The last thing she wanted was for Jacob to feel the same pain she had. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Startled, she closed the journal and placed it back in her bag before crossing the room to answer. To her surprise, Jacob stood there, his expression unusually serious. "Hey, Mom," he said, stepping inside when she opened the door. "We need to talk." "What is it?" Abigail asked, her stomach tightening with apprehension. "It's about him, Henry Dawson." Jacob's tone was steady, but she could see the questions brewing in his eyes. Abigail sighed, moving to sit on the small sofa. "What about him?" Jacob hesitated before speaking. "I ran into him this morning. He wants to talk. About the past. About you." Abigail's jaw tightened. "And what did you say?" "I told him he should talk to you," Jacob replied, leaning against the wall. But honestly, Mom, I think there's more to this than you're telling me. Abigail felt the weight of his words settle over her. Jacob, there are things about my past, about his past, that I didn't think you needed to know. Maybe I do now, Jacob said, his voice firm but not unkind. He's clearly trying to make amends. I just want to understand why. Abigail looked away, her mind racing. She had spent so many years guarding the truth, but now it seemed inevitable that it would come out. The question was, could she face it without reopening old wounds? Henry, meanwhile, lingered on the deck, staring out at the endless expanse of ocean. He had come on this cruise to escape his regrets, but now it seemed fate had brought them directly to him, and this time, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face them. Henry stood at the ship's railing, staring into the endless horizon. The gentle rocking of the cruise ship and the crisp ocean air should have been calming, but his thoughts were anything but serene. His brief conversation with Jacob had left him hopeful, yet uncertain. The young man's guarded demeanor was understandable, but Henry couldn't shake the feeling that Jacob's curiosity might be the key to bridging the gap between them. As Henry mulled over his next steps, the distant chime of the ship's intercom announced activities for the day. He barely noticed the bustling passengers around him as he turned back toward the cafe, hoping to catch another glimpse of Jacob, or perhaps Abigail. In another part of the ship, Abigail sat in the ship's cozy library, flipping through a book she wasn't reading. Her mind kept returning to the letters she had hidden for so many years. She had buried that part of her life for Jacob's sake, but now it was surfacing in ways she hadn't anticipated. The ship's quiet atmosphere wasn't enough to still her racing thoughts. Her solitude was interrupted by Jacob, who walked in with purpose, his expression a mix of determination and hesitation. Abigail looked up, closing the book with a soft thud. "Jacob," she greeted cautiously. "What's on your mind?" He slid into the chair across from her, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "I've been thinking about him, Henry." Abigail stiffened but said nothing, letting Jacob continue. "He told me he wants to make things right," Jacob said, his tone even. "And I want to know why now. Why after all this time?" Abigail sighed, her fingers tightening around the book's edges. "Henry Dawson has a long history of doing things on his terms, Jacob. I wouldn't read too much into it." "Maybe," Jacob replied, but he seemed genuine. Abigail's heart ached at the hope she detected in his voice. She had worked so hard to protect Jacob from the pain of her past, but she could see that withholding the truth might now be doing more harm than good. "He wasn't always like this," she admitted, her voice softer. "When I first met Henry, he was charming, ambitious. I thought he was the love of my life." She paused, memories flashing through her mind. "But when I told him I was pregnant, everything changed. His mother, Eleanor, convinced him I was lying, manipulated him into believing I wanted to trap him for his fortune." Jacob leaned back, processing her words. "And he didn't believe you?" "No," Abigail said, her voice thick with emotion. "He threw me out of his mansion. No discussion, no chance to explain. He chose his mother's lies over me, and over you." Jacob's jaw tightened. "He didn't know about me." Abigail shook her head. "He didn't want to know. And by the time he might have reconsidered, I was gone. I couldn't stay, Jacob. Not after what he did." The weight of her words hung between them, heavy with unspoken pain. Jacob nodded slowly, as if piecing together a puzzle he hadn't realized was missing pieces. "So what do we do now?" he asked. Abigail hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out the journal containing Eleanor's letters. She handed it to Jacob. "Read these, then you'll understand why I've been so careful." That afternoon, as Jacob sat alone on the sunlit balcony of their cabin, he opened the journal and began to read. The letters were as venomous as Abigail had described. Eleanor's words were sharp and calculated, dripping with disdain for Abigail and her lowly background. One letter in particular stood out. "Henry, do not be fooled by Abigail's tears. She is beneath you. And her pregnancy is nothing more than a ploy to secure her place in our family. If you care about our name, our fortune, and your future, you will sever ties with her immediately. I have taken care of everything." Eleanor. Jacob clenched the journal in his hands, anger and disbelief swirling inside him. It was clear that Eleanor had orchestrated the entire fallout between his parents, exploiting Henry's insecurities to drive Abigail away. But what surprised Jacob even more was how his mother had held onto these letters for so long. She could have burned them, erased the evidence, but she hadn't. Why? Meanwhile, Henry returned to his suite, finding a message waiting for him at the door. It was a simple note, written in Abigail's handwriting. "Meet me at the observation deck at sunset." His heart pounded as he read the words. Abigail was willing to talk. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The observation deck was quiet when Henry arrived, the golden hues of the setting sun painting the ocean in vibrant shades of orange and pink. Abigail stood near the railing, her silhouette framed by the brilliant backdrop. Henry approached cautiously, his footsteps soft on the wooden deck. "You came," she said without turning around. "I wasn't going to pass up the chance," Henry replied, his voice steady but tinged with nerves. Abigail finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Jacob knows everything now. About Eleanor, about the letters. He's angry, confused, and I don't blame him." Henry nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "I deserve that. I deserve worse." "I didn't ask you here to assign blame, Henry," Abigail said. "I asked you here because I need to know something. After all these years, why now? Why try to make things right?" Henry took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "Because I've spent 25 years regretting the moment I let you walk out that door, and seeing you, seeing Jacob, it's made me realize that I can't let the rest of my life be defined by the mistakes I made." Abigail's gaze softened, though her walls were still firmly in place. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Henry, but for Jacob's sake, I'll give you the chance to explain yourself. To both of us. It wasn't much, but it was more than Henry had dared hope for. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he felt the smallest flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could begin to repair what he had broken. The next morning, the soft hum of the cruise ship's engines blended with the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. Henry arrived at the lounge where Abigail had agreed to meet him and Jacob. He felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Yet he knew it would dredge up painful truths. Abigail was already there when he arrived, seated at a small table near the panoramic windows. Sunlight spilled across the room, illuminating her features and the guarded expression she wore. Jacob sat beside her, his posture tense but attentive. In front of them lay the leather journal, its edges worn and its secrets exposed. Henry hesitated for a moment, then joined them. "Thank you for meeting with me," he said, his voice steady but subdued. Abigail gave a curt nod, while Jacob simply gestured for him to sit. "You wanted a chance to explain," Abigail said, her tone neutral. "So here we are." Henry cleared his throat, his gaze shifting between them. "I don't know where to begin. There's so much I wish I could undo, so much I regret, but I suppose the truth is the best place to start." He gestured toward the journal. "Those letters, I had no idea they existed. I didn't know what my mother had done until now, but I can't hide behind that as an excuse. I let her influence me. I chose to believe her lies instead of trusting you, Abigail." Abigail's expression didn't change, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion. Anger, sadness, or perhaps a mix of both. "You didn't just believe her, Henry. You acted on it. You threw me out like I was nothing. You made it clear that I didn't belong in your world." Her words hung in the air like a sharp blade, and Henry felt them cut deep. He nodded slowly. "You're right. I was arrogant and selfish. I was too concerned with what my family and the world thought of me, and I didn't see how much damage I was doing until it was too late." Jacob, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "And what about me?" His voice was calm but laced with an edge of bitterness. "You didn't even try to find us. You didn't care enough to know if I even existed." Henry turned to face Jacob, his chest tightening at the accusation. "You're right," he admitted. I didn't try. I told myself it was because you weren't mine. But deep down, I think I was afraid. Afraid of what I might find if I looked." "Afraid," Jacob repeated, shaking his head. "That's a pretty convenient excuse." "It's not an excuse," Henry said quickly. "It's the truth, and it's something I'll regret for the rest of my life." Abigail leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "And now, what do you want from us, Henry? Redemption? Forgiveness?" Henry met her gaze, his expression earnest. I want to make things right. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be part of your lives, both of your lives, if you'll let me. I want to earn your trust, not demand it." Jacob leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "That's a tall order, considering you've had 25 years to show up and didn't." "I know," Henry replied, his voice soft. "And I don't expect it to happen overnight, but I'm here now, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Abigail exchanged a glance with Jacob, her expression unreadable then. To Henry's surprise, she reached for the journal and slid it toward him. "Read the letters," she said. "Every word. Then you'll understand exactly what we've been living with." Henry spent the rest of the morning poring over the letters in his suite. Each one felt like a punch to the gut. Eleanor's words were calculated, dripping with venom and a sense of superiority. She had painted Abigail as a gold digger, a threat to the Dawson legacy, and had left no room for Henry to question her claims. But the most damning letter was the one that detailed how she had taken care of everything. Eleanor had orchestrated the entire fallout, ensuring that Abigail was left with no support and no way to fight back. By the time Henry finished reading, his hands were trembling, and his chest felt tight with rage and shame. How could he have been so blind, so easily manipulated? His mother's actions were monstrous, but his complicity was just as damning. Back to his house in that evening, Henry returned to the lounge where Abigail and Jacob were waiting. He placed the journal carefully on the table and looked at them both. "I read them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All of them." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "And I don't even know where to begin," Henry admitted. "My mother. What she did was unforgivable, and I let it happen. I believed her lies because it was easier than facing the truth, and in doing so, I failed both of you." Jacob studied him for a moment, then leaned forward. "So what are you going to do about it?" Henry hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. "First, I'm going to confront my mother. She needs to know that I've seen the truth. And then, I want to start over, if you'll let me." Abigail's expression softened, but she didn't respond right away. Finally, she said, "We'll see, Henry. This isn't something that can be fixed with words alone." Henry nodded, understanding the weight of her words. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, not because he had been forgiven, but because he was finally willing to fight for the family he had lost. Henry left the lounge with a heavy heart, clutching the weight of Abigail's words like a lifeline. This isn't something that can be fixed with words alone. The truth of that statement resonated deeply. Words had been the foundation of the lies and manipulations that tore them apart. Now, only actions could rebuild what had been shattered. In his suite, Henry sat by the window, the vast ocean stretching endlessly before him. The journal lay open on the table, Eleanor's venomous words etched into his mind. The mother he had trusted implicitly had betrayed not just Abigail, but him as well. For years, he had been a pawn in her scheme, too blind and prideful to see the damage she had inflicted. Henry reached for his phone, his hand trembling slightly. He hadn't spoken to Eleanor in weeks, but the moment he dialed her number, the familiar sharpness of her voice greeted him. "Henry," she began, "I was wondering when you'd call. How's the cruise? I hope you're making good use of your time." He took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the phone. "Mother," he said, his voice low but firm, "I know everything." There was a brief pause, then a cool chuckle. "Everything? That's quite the claim, Henry. Care to elaborate?" "The letters," he said bluntly. "Abigail kept them, every single one. I've read them all, and I know exactly what you did." Eleanor's tone shifted, a thin layer of annoyance creeping in. "Those letters are ancient history. I did what I had to do to protect you, Henry. That girl was beneath you, she—" "Stop!" Henry's voice cracked like a whip, cutting her off. "You didn't protect me, Mother. You destroyed my life. You destroyed my chance to be with the woman I loved. To raise my son, to have a family, all because of your hatred and arrogance. Your son," Eleanor's voice dripped with disdain. "So she convinced you the boy is yours. How convenient." "He is mine," Henry snapped. "And even if he weren't, that doesn't justify what you did. You lied, manipulated, and tore us apart. And for what? To protect a fortune I didn't even care about." There was silence on the other end of the line, but Henry wasn't done. "I'm done with your games, Mother. I'm done letting you control me. Don't contact me again." He ended the call before she could respond, his chest heaving as he set the phone down. The room felt both quieter and heavier, the silence amplifying the emotions coursing through him. It was the first time he had ever stood up to Eleanor, and though it left him feeling raw, there was also a sense of liberation. Later that evening, Henry found Abigail and Jacob seated at the ship's outdoor lounge, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of string lights. He approached cautiously, unsure of his reception. "I confronted her," Henry said, his voice steady but subdued. Abigail raised an eyebrow. "Her. My mother," Henry clarified. "I told her I knew the truth, and I told her she's no longer a part of my life." Abigail's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "And what did she say?" "She didn't deny it," Henry admitted. "She tried to justify it, of course. But I made it clear. I'm done letting her dictate my life." Jacob, who had been silent, leaned forward. "That's a start, but it doesn't change what happened." "I know," Henry said, meeting his son's gaze. "And I don't expect it to, but I needed to take that step. For myself, and for you." Jacob studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, so, what now?" The next day, Abigail took some time alone, walking along the ship's promenade as the sea breeze whipped through her hair. She couldn't deny that Henry's actions had surprised her. The man she had once loved, the man who had betrayed her, was beginning to show signs of the person she had believed him to be all those years ago. But the scars ran deep, and trust wasn't something she could offer easily. She thought of Jacob and the questions he had been asking lately. Her son was curious, conflicted, and perhaps even hopeful. That hope scared her more than anything. She had spent years shielding him from the pain Henry had caused. But now, it was clear that Jacob wanted answers, and perhaps even a relationship with his father. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Abigail found herself back on the observation deck, the same place where she had first spoken to Henry since their unexpected reunion. She wasn't surprised when he joined her, his footsteps soft against the wooden planks. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the horizon. She didn't reply, her gaze fixed on the setting sun. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "Jacob wants to know you. He won't admit it outright, but I can see it." Henry's breath hitched. "I'd like to know him too, more than anything." Abigail turned to face him, her expression serious. "If I let you into his life, there's no room for mistakes, Henry. He's already been through enough." "I understand," Henry said earnestly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want a chance to prove myself. To you and to him." Abigail studied him, her eyes searching for any sign of insincerity. What she found instead was vulnerability, a raw honesty she hadn't seen in decades. She sighed, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her. "We'll see," she said softly. "For now, just take it one step at a time." Henry nodded, his heart swelling with cautious hope. For the first time in years, he felt that redemption wasn't just a distant dream. It was within reach. Henry's heart raced as he left the observation deck. Abigail's words, though guarded, echoed in his mind. Take it one step at a time. It wasn't forgiveness, nor was it an open invitation, but it was a crack in the door he had thought forever closed. He clung to that sliver of hope like a lifeline. The next morning, Henry decided to take his first real step toward knowing Jacob. He approached the younger man in the gym, where Jacob was lifting weights. The space was quieter than usual, most passengers opting for more leisurely activities, but the hum of treadmills and clinking of metal filled the air. "Mind some company?" Henry asked, his tone light but tinged with hesitation. Jacob looked up, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. He shrugged. "Suit yourself." Henry took a seat on the bench next to him, watching as Jacob finished his set. For a moment, neither spoke. Henry realized how much Jacob resembled him at that age, not just in appearance but in the intensity of his focus. "You've got a strong form," Henry said, breaking the silence. "You play sports." Jacob set the weights down and reached for a towel. "Used to, soccer mostly. I stopped after college." Henry nodded, seizing the opportunity to ask more. "What do you do now?" "I'm in marketing," Jacob replied, wiping his face. "I work for a startup in Charleston. It's small, but we're growing." "That's impressive," Henry said, genuinely admiring his son's determination. You must have a sharp mind for business." Jacob glanced at him, his expression neutral but curious. "And you? What do you do these days? Still running your empire?" Henry hesitated. The truth was, his business ventures no longer carried the same allure they once had. "I'm still involved, but it's not what it used to be. Honestly, I've been stepping back, trying to figure out what matters most." Jacob nodded slowly, sensing the weight behind his words. "And have you figured it out yet?" Henry smiled faintly. "I think I'm starting to." Later that day, Abigail observed Henry and Jacob from a distance as they sat together on the ship's outdoor terrace. They weren't laughing or chatting animatedly, but the tension between them seemed to have eased slightly. It was a sight she hadn't expected to see so soon, and it left her feeling a mix of emotions she couldn't quite place. For years, she had carried the burden of raising Jacob alone. She had been his mother, his protector, his everything. The thought of Henry now stepping into Jacob's life made her uneasy, even if she knew deep down that Jacob deserved to make his own choices. That evening, Abigail joined Jacob in their cabin. He was seated on the bed, scrolling through his phone, but looked up as she entered. "How was your day?" she asked, sitting beside him. Jacob shrugged. "Fine. Talked to him for a bit." Abigail's stomach tightened. "And?" Jacob leaned back, propping himself on his elbows. "I don't know. He seems genuine, I guess. But it's weird, having someone show up out of nowhere and say they want to be a part of your life. It's more complicated than that," Abigail said softly. Jacob turned to her, his brows furrowed. "Then tell me what I'm missing." Abigail sighed, the weight of her past pressing heavily on her chest. "When I left Newport, I didn't just leave because of what he did. I left because I didn't see another choice. Eleanor made sure of that." She paused, her voice faltering. "She threatened to ruin me, Jacob. She had the resources, the influence. I was scared. I didn't want to bring you into a world where you'd always feel like you didn't belong." Jacob nodded slowly, processing her words. "And now, do you think he's really changed?" Abigail looked away, her gaze fixed on the ocean visible through the cabin window. "I don't know. People can change, but trust doesn't come easily." Meanwhile, Henry found himself alone in his suite, staring at the framed photo he had brought with him. A picture of his younger self, smiling proudly in front of the Newport mansion. The man in the photo seemed like a stranger now, a relic of a life consumed by pride and ambition. He thought about Jacob's questions earlier. "Have you figured out what matters most?" It was a simple question, yet it struck at the core of his regrets. The answer had always been there, buried beneath years of denial. Abigail and Jacob. They had always been what mattered most, but he had realized it far too late. The next evening, a formal dinner brought all the passengers together once again. Henry dressed carefully, his mind focused on how to continue rebuilding the fragile bridge between himself, Abigail, and Jacob. When he entered the dining hall, he spotted them seated near the center of the room. Jacob's posture was relaxed, while Abigail's eyes scanned the crowd with her usual air of guarded confidence. Henry approached their table, his heart pounding. "May I join you?" he asked, his voice steady but soft. Abigail glanced at Jacob, who gave a small nod. "Sure," she said, her tone neutral. As the meal progressed, the conversation was polite but stilted. Henry made an effort to listen, asking Jacob about his work and sharing stories about his own youthful ventures. Abigail remained quiet, her watchful eyes assessing his every move. By the time dessert was served, Henry felt a small shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it wasn't hostility either. It was something in between, a tentative step toward understanding. When the meal ended, Jacob excused himself, leaving Henry and Abigail alone at the table. For a moment, they sat in silence, the hum of the dining hall filling the space between them. "Thank you," Henry said finally, his voice sincere, "for giving me this chance. I know it's not easy." Abigail met his gaze, her expression softening just enough to give him hope. "It's not, but Jacob deserves to know who you are, and maybe, so do I." As she stood to leave, Henry watched her go, his heart swelling with a cautious optimism. The walls between them were beginning to crack, and for the first time in years, he felt that the future might hold more than just regret. The next morning, Henry woke early, a sense of determination coursing through him. The evening's conversation had left him hopeful, but he knew that the shadows of Eleanor's influence still lingered over his relationship with Abigail and Jacob. If he wanted to move forward, he had to confront those shadows head-on. Henry reached for his phone, dialing the number for his assistant back in Newport. The call was brief but decisive. He needed every record, every document, and every detail tied to Eleanor's actions from the time Abigail had left his life. The truth had to come out in full, no matter how painful. Meanwhile, Abigail and Jacob sat together on the ship's upper deck, the morning sun casting a golden glow over the ocean. Abigail had hoped for a quiet moment, but Jacob's restlessness was palpable. "Do you think he's really done with her?" Jacob asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "Who?" Abigail replied, though she already knew the answer. "Eleanor," Jacob said, his tone sharp. "Do you think he's actually cutting her out of his life, or is this just part of some act?" Abigail sighed, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think he means it, Jacob, but Eleanor's influence runs deep. It always has." Jacob frowned, leaning back in his chair. "So what happens if she decides to meddle again?" Abigail didn't answer right away. Instead, she thought about the years she had spent avoiding Newport, avoiding Eleanor's shadow. Then it's up to him to prove that he's strong enough to stand up to her, not just for us, but for himself. As the day progressed, Henry received the documents he had requested. His assistant had compiled everything: letters, emails, and financial records that painted a damning picture of Eleanor's machinations. Henry's hands trembled as he read through the files. The extent of her manipulations was far worse than he had imagined. She hadn't just driven Abigail away. She had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure Abigail's silence, using legal threats, financial sabotage, and even private investigators to track her movements in the years after their separation. Eleanor had acted out of fear of losing control over the Dawson fortune, and fear of her son forging a life outside her influence. Henry felt a swell of anger as he closed the folder. This wasn't just about Abigail anymore. It was about the legacy of control and fear that Eleanor had built around him. He knew what he had to do. And that evening, Henry found Abigail and Jacob in the lounge. Abigail was nursing a glass of wine, her expression thoughtful, while Jacob scrolled through his phone. They looked up as Henry approached, his face set with determination. "Can we talk?" Henry asked, his voice calm but firm. Abigail exchanged a glance with Jacob before nodding. "What's on your mind?" Henry sat down, placing the folder on the table between them. "I've been digging into what happened after you left, and I think you both deserve to know the full truth." Abigail tensed, her eyes flicking to the folder. "What kind of truth?" Henry opened the folder, revealing its contents. "Eleanor didn't just lie to me about you. She went much further than I ever realized. She threatened you, tracked you, and tried to destroy any chance you had of building a life." Abigail's face paled as she flipped through the documents, her hands trembling slightly. Jacob leaned in, his jaw tightening with each page he read. This is insane," Jacob muttered, shaking his head. "She was obsessed. She was afraid," Henry corrected quietly. "Afraid of losing control, and I let her fear dictate my choices." Abigail closed the folder, her expression a mix of anger and sadness. "You didn't just let her, Henry. You enabled her. Whether you knew it or not, you gave her the power to do this." "I know," Henry said, his voice heavy with regret. "And I can't change that, but I can stand up to her now. I already told her she's no longer a part of my life. But this," he gestured to the folder, "this needs to be exposed. The world deserves to know what she's done." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "You're going public with this." Henry nodded. "It's the only way to ensure she can't hurt anyone else. I'm done letting her control me, and I'm done letting her legacy overshadow what's right." Later that evening, Abigail sat alone on the ship's observation deck, the folder resting on her lap. She flipped through the pages again, each revelation bringing back memories she had tried to bury. The threats, the fear, the nights spent wondering if she and Jacob would ever truly be safe. It all came rushing back. Henry found her there, his footsteps soft against the wooden planks. "Abigail," he said, his voice gentle. She didn't look up. "You knew she was controlling Henry, but you didn't stop her." "I know," he admitted, taking a seat beside her. "I was weak, and I let my pride and fear blind me to what she was doing." Abigail closed the folder, finally turning to face him. This doesn't fix what happened. It doesn't erase the years I spent looking over my shoulder. I know, Henry said again, but I hope it's a start. Not just for you, but for Jacob, and for me. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the waves crashing softly below. Abigail's walls were still up, but Henry could see the cracks forming, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that healing was possible. The following morning, Henry found himself walking along the ship's promenade, the crisp ocean air doing little to ease the tension in his chest. The night before had been a turning point, one he had hoped for, but that still left him questioning whether he was truly making progress with Abigail and Jacob. He was no stranger to hard work, but rebuilding trust with them felt like climbing a mountain with no clear summit. As he approached the cafe on the upper deck, he spotted Jacob sitting alone, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. Gathering his resolve, Henry approached, his steps purposeful but cautious. "Morning," Henry said, sliding into the chair across from him. Jacob glanced up, his expression neutral. "Morning." For a moment, they sat in silence, the sound of waves filling the space between them. Henry noticed the folder Jacob had brought with him, its contents undoubtedly still fresh in his mind. "You've been going through it," Henry said, nodding toward the folder. Jacob set down his coffee and leaned back in his chair. "Yeah, it's a lot to take in." "I can imagine," Henry replied, his tone soft. "I've been doing the same, reading through it all. I keep wondering how I didn't see it back then, how I let it happen." Jacob studied him for a moment before speaking. "It's not just about what she did, you know. It's about the fact that you let her drive my mom out of your life. Out of my life." "I know," Henry admitted, "and I don't expect you to forgive me for that, but I want to make it right, if you'll let me." Jacob let out a breath, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "I don't know if that's something you can fix, but..." He paused, his voice softening. "I think it's worth a try." The hint of openness in Jacob's words struck Henry like a lifeline. He nodded, grateful but careful not to push too hard. "That's all I'm asking for." Later that day, Abigail found herself watching from a distance as Henry and Jacob worked together at the ship's activity center, attempting a game of shuffleboard. It was a simple scene, but one that stirred unexpected emotions in her. Jacob's guarded demeanor seemed to have softened, and Henry appeared genuinely invested in making a connection with his son. For years, Abigail had shouldered the responsibility of raising Jacob alone. She had been his rock, his protector, his everything. Now, seeing him interact with Henry brought a mix of relief and apprehension. She had spent so long building a life without Henry that allowing him even a small place in Jacob's life felt like an act of vulnerability. That evening, Abigail and Henry found themselves alone on the ship's deck, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. Abigail leaned against the railing, her arms crossed while Henry stood beside her, his hands resting on the cool metal. "I saw you with Jacob today," Abigail said, breaking the silence. Her tone was calm, but there was a note of curiosity in her voice. Henry glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "He's a remarkable young man. You did an incredible job raising him." Abigail shrugged, though the compliment didn't go unnoticed. "I did what I had to do. I wish I could have been there," Henry said softly, "to help, to support you both. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be there now, for both of you." Abigail turned to face him, her gaze steady but guarded. "It's not that simple, Henry. Trust isn't something you can just rebuild overnight." "I know," he replied, "but I'm willing to earn it, no matter how long it takes." Abigail sighed, her expression softening slightly. "Jacob seems to think you're worth a second chance. That means something to me." Henry's heart lifted at her words, though he knew they weren't an open invitation. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." As the days passed, the ship's journey continued, and so did the fragile rebuilding of their family dynamic. Henry made an effort to spend time with Jacob, learning about his life and interests while sharing stories of his own. Their conversations were still tentative, but there was a growing sense of mutual respect. Abigail, meanwhile, remained cautious but observant. She watched as Henry and Jacob began to bond, their interactions becoming more natural with each passing day. It was a bittersweet sight. one that reminded her of what could have been, but also gave her hope for what might still be. One evening, as the ship hosted a casual dance on the main deck, Henry approached Abigail, extending a hand. "May I have this dance?" Abigail hesitated, her instincts urging her to refuse, but something in Henry's eyes, a quiet sincerity, made her reconsider. With a small nod, she took his hand, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. The music was slow and melodic, the kind that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken words as they swayed together under the stars. Abigail felt a flicker of the connection they had once shared. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. "You've changed," she said softly, her gaze meeting his. "So have you," he replied, a faint smile on his lips. "For the better." Abigail allowed herself a small smile, though her walls remained firmly in place. "We'll see." That night, as Henry lay in bed, he reflected on the progress they had made. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that the future might hold something more than regret. It might hold redemption. The final days of the cruise seemed to pass in a blur, each moment a mix of tentative connections and cautious optimism. Henry, Abigail, and Jacob found themselves falling into an unexpected rhythm. Meals shared in relative peace, conversations sprinkled with genuine curiosity, and fleeting moments where the past seemed to loosen its grip on their present. Yet, the tension beneath the surface lingered. Forgiveness was not an easy road, and the wounds of the past remained tender. One quiet afternoon, Jacob approached Abigail on the balcony of their cabin. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, its gentle waves mirroring the calm yet restless energy between mother and son. "You've been quiet," Jacob remarked, leaning on the railing beside her. Abigail glanced at him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Just thinking." "About him?" Jacob asked, his tone even. Abigail hesitated before nodding. "About everything. It's been a lot to process." Jacob sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I didn't expect this, any of it, but I think he's trying, Mom. I really do." Abigail studied her son's profile, the determination and kindness in his expression so much like her own. "You've always had a big heart, Jacob. Bigger than mine sometimes." Jacob chuckled softly. "You've had to protect yours more." Abigail's smile faded slightly, her thoughts drifting back to the years of struggle and resilience. "It's not easy to let someone back in after they've hurt you. But you're right. He is trying." Jacob turned to her, his voice quieter now. "Do you think you can forgive him?" Abigail's gaze dropped to her hands resting on the railing. "I don't know, but I think I can try." In that evening, Abigail found Henry sitting alone on the ship's upper deck, the warm glow of lanterns casting long shadows around him. He looked up as she approached, a mix of surprise and hope flashing across his face. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. "Of course not," Henry replied, gesturing to the chair beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. The soft murmur of waves and the distant hum of laughter from the ship's dining hall filled the silence. "I talked to Jacob," Abigail said finally. "He seems to think there's something worth salvaging here." Henry nodded, his heart pounding. "I hope so. He's a remarkable young man. You've done an incredible job raising him." Abigail gave a small, almost wistful smile. "I didn't do it alone. He's always had this strength in him, a kind of goodness that I didn't teach him. It's just who he is." Henry leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I see that, and I see so much of you in him. Your resilience, your kindness. It's humbling." Abigail tilted her head, studying him. "You've changed, Henry. I didn't think it was possible, but you have." "I've had a lot of time to think," he admitted, "to see the damage I caused. Not just to you, but to myself. I lost the two people who mattered most to me because I was too proud, too blind to see the truth. I don't want to make that mistake again." Abigail nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "I can't promise anything, but I think I'm ready to try, for Jacob's sake. And maybe, for ours." Henry's breath hitched, emotion rising in his chest. "That's all I've ever wanted, a chance to try." The final night of the cruise was marked by a grand gala, a formal affair where passengers gathered to celebrate the end of their journey. The dining hall glittered with crystal chandeliers and elegant decorations, the air buzzing with excitement and laughter. Abigail and Jacob entered together, both dressed sharply for the occasion. Henry spotted them from across the room and made his way over. His heart pounding, he wore a tailored black suit, his movements careful and deliberate. "You both look wonderful," he said warmly, his gaze shifting between them. "Thanks," Jacob replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. Abigail nodded in acknowledgement, her expression calm but not unkind, as the evening progressed. The three of them shared a table, their conversation flowing more naturally than it had before. There was still an undercurrent of hesitation, but it was tempered by a growing sense of connection. Toward the end of the night, Jacob rose from his seat, a glass of champagne in hand. He tapped the edge of the glass gently with a fork, drawing the room's attention. "I just wanted to say a few words," Jacob began, his voice clear and steady. "This cruise has been unexpected, to say the least, but it's also been meaningful in ways I didn't anticipate." He glanced at Abigail, then at Henry. "I grew up hearing about how my mom raised me on her own, how strong and independent she had to be, and she is all of those things, strong, independent, and incredible. But I think I've learned something else on this trip. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about choosing to move forward in spite of it." Abigail's eyes glistened as she listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jacob turned to Henry. "I don't know what the future holds for us, but I do know this. You're here now, and you're trying, and for that, I'm willing to give you a chance." The room broke into soft applause, the sound washing over the trio like a wave of affirmation. Henry's chest tightened as he looked at his son, then at Abigail, who gave him a small, tearful smile. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild, one step at a time. The applause lingered, echoing softly in Henry's ears as Jacob returned to his seat. Abigail reached out to place a gentle hand on her son's, her expression a mix of pride and vulnerability. For Henry, the moment felt surreal. His son, the young man he had spent years unknowingly abandoning, was offering him a chance to heal old wounds. Abigail's tentative warmth was the final piece of a puzzle he never thought he'd get to solve. As the dinner carried on, the energy in the room was buoyant, with laughter and chatter filling the air. Yet, at their table, a quieter, more reflective mood prevailed. Henry watched as Abigail and Jacob shared a moment of closeness, their bond so natural and unwavering. It was humbling to see the result of Abigail's strength and sacrifice, a testament to what he had missed. "I'm proud of you, Jacob," Henry said softly, breaking the momentary silence. "Your words tonight, they meant more than I can say." Jacob glanced at him, his usual guarded demeanor giving way to a flicker of appreciation. "I just said what I felt, but this doesn't mean it'll be easy." "I know," Henry replied earnestly, "but I'll do whatever it takes to prove myself." As the evening approached its final course, Jacob excused himself, leaving Abigail and Henry alone at the table. The glow of the chandeliers bathed the room in warm light, casting a softness over Abigail's face. She leaned back slightly, swirling the last of her wine in her glass. "Jacob has always been a good judge of character," she said, her tone measured. "He wouldn't have said those things tonight if he didn't believe in the possibility of a better future." Henry nodded. "He's remarkable. That's a reflection of you." Abigail allowed herself a small smile, but her eyes were thoughtful. "And yet, you've found a way to connect with him. That says something too." Henry took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I don't take it for granted. I know how much I've missed, how much I've lost because of my choices, but I also know that if I have a chance to make things right, it's because of your strength. You never gave up. Not on yourself, and not on him." Abigail met his eyes, her expression softening. "We survived, Henry, but that doesn't mean the scars disappeared. I don't expect them to," he said. "But I'm here now, and I want to be here, for both of you." As the final course was served, Jacob returned to the table carrying a small box. His face was calm, but there was a determined glint in his eyes. "I have one more thing to say," Jacob announced, placing the box in the center of the table. Both Abigail and Henry looked at him curiously. "What is this?" Abigail asked, her brow furrowing. Jacob gestured to the box. "It's something I've been meaning to share. It's about Mom, and it's about you, Henry." With deliberate movements, Jacob opened the box to reveal a set of neatly folded documents. He slid them toward Henry, whose confusion deepened as he picked them up and began to read. "These are business acquisitions," Henry said, his voice tinged with surprise. Jacob nodded. "Mom has been involved in more than just raising me and running her own businesses. Over the years, she's been quietly acquiring companies, specifically ones that were tied to the Dawson family." Abigail's eyes widened, turning sharply to her son. Jacob held up a hand. "It's time, Mom. He deserves to know." Henry's hands trembled as he flipped through the documents. Each acquisition detailed how Abigail, under an alias, had strategically purchased failing businesses that once belonged to the Dawson family. The moves were calculated, ensuring their survival without Henry ever realizing who was behind them. "Why?" Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he looked at Abigail. She sighed, her gaze softening. "Because I didn't want to see you lose everything. Despite everything that happened, I knew what your family legacy meant to you. I didn't do it for revenge, Henry. I did it because I believed in what those companies could be." Henry's chest tightened, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "You saved me. You saved my family's name. And I didn't even know." Abigail smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for the recognition. I did it because I couldn't let your mother's actions destroy something you worked so hard to build." Even after everything, Jacob leaned forward, his voice steady. "That's who she is. She could have let everything crumble, but she didn't. And now, I think it's time for you to see that." Henry's throat tightened as he looked at Abigail, a woman he had wronged so deeply, yet who had never stopped believing in the good he was capable of. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to," Abigail replied softly. "But if you really want to show me you've changed, you'll keep building something worth being proud of, for yourself and for Jacob." The gala ended with the three of them standing together on the ship's deck, the moonlight casting a silvery glow over the ocean. For the first time in decades, Henry felt a sense of peace, not because the wounds of the past had healed completely, but because the process of healing had truly begun. Abigail leaned against the railing, her gaze on the horizon. "This isn't the end. Henry, it's just the beginning." He nodded, standing beside her. "A beginning I'll fight to make right." Jacob joined them, his presence completing the picture of a family slowly rebuilding itself. Together, they stood in silence, letting the rhythm of the waves guide them forward, toward a future shaped by love, forgiveness, and the strength to overcome the past.